Hello everyone, very welcome to this webinar about running SAP on Azure. My name is Gunter Dewitte. I'm working as a manager within Core Technology Services of Delaware. And actually today I'm going to provide you some insight in the journey when running SAP on Azure. Now during this webinar you will have the possibility to ask questions if you want by using the chat box. And afterwards, at the end of the webinar, you will have the possibility to ask questions directly to me. In the first place, I will explain you what the drivers are when customers are considering Microsoft Azure to run their SAP environment. In a second part, I will give you some insight in the journey about the experience and the challenges that we have been facing when rolling out SAP on Azure for multiple customers. And then as a third part, I'm going to provide you what the real value is that we have seen when combining both technologies. And then at the end, there will be a conclusion, just give you a quick summary on what the benefits and advantages are of combining both technologies. And of course, as I said, allowing you the possibility to ask some questions. So now let's first look into what the drivers are that customers really look into when they consider SAP on Azure. Probably when you have chosen to run SAP, the first question would be, are you sure that Microsoft Azure, being a public cloud, is the right platform to run my business critical application? Well, the good news is that actually the answer is yes, because both technology partners made a strong commitment to each other and promised that their customers could really leverage the best of both worlds. The second question I often got is like, why is infrastructure so important? Well, consider it like you just bought a very nice fancy car and you do have an excellent, nice, high technology dashboard on it, but then it turns out that the engine, which is part of your car, does not provide you the power that you need to accelerate and to move your business along different directions. Then the question is, what's so fancy about having a nice dashboard? So compare the engine of the car with the infrastructure that you need to run your business critical application. A third driver is actually the fact that cloud is on earth. What does that mean? It means that you have the possibility to choose amongst 40 different cloud data centers. So consider how you want to benefit from that perspective. Maybe you have more users sitting in the United States than in Europe or in an APAC country, which gives you the possibility to pick it smoothly and to pick it in an intelligent way when moving forward with these kind of projects. And then of course, what about Agile? What does Agile mean? Well, I will give you some concrete examples how we have seen in reality the real value of Agile. And then of course, the question is flexibility really that important if we look into projects like SAP on Azure? Well, I can tell you it is. Imagine that you have decided to start the rollout of an SAP project. Well, what you typically will see is that it takes like months. And that is not because of the fact that it is SAP, but it's because of the fact that you just need to go in the best practices rolling out the SAP environment. You will probably start with a sandbox, you will run into a development environment, you will do some qualifications on a CAS environment, and then in the end you will turn it into a production environment. That means that all those steps takes time, and meanwhile it gives you the possibility to learn and to adapt to changes. Because changes, it's a given during this kind of project. And that is, of course, where flexibility pops up when you're using Microsoft Azure to run the SAP environment. Then what about certification? Certification really tells you something about the guarantees that you have. How am I going to be sure as a customer that when I choose to run SAP on Microsoft Azure, I will get the real performance I am expecting, so I can tell my users, you will have the right user experience. That is where certifications becomes extremely important when combining both technologies. Interesting is also the fact that imagine that you are not ready to go for the cloud at this stage, but you look into the possibility to build disaster recovery solutions, or you look into the improvement of your business continuity plan, then another alternative is really looking into a kind of a hybrid situation, which means that you're going to combine the on-premise situation you have, for instance, because your infrastructure is pretty new or recent and it has not been amortized yet. Then you can, of course, combine it with the possibility to build a disaster recovery on Microsoft Azure and by this improve the overall continuity and availability of your business critical application. And of course, sometimes I get a question, so what about migration? I am going to the cloud. Is it really that simple to migrate to the cloud? Well, the answer is yes. Lucky for us, SAP has built in some very interesting technologies allowing you to smoothly migrate from your current as-is situation to the new cloud situation. And last but not least, can I trust a public cloud like Microsoft Azure? Again, the answer is yes. And I think this is really very important because more and more industries today are looking into specific certifications, are looking into some specific compliances. Think about GDPR, think about ISO, and all other certifications which are very specific to some of these industries. Well, I can tell you that with Microsoft Azure, you do have a very nice compliancy card showing you over more than 50 kinds of certifications. So the chance is pretty big that your compliancy or certification that you're looking into will be there. And then, of course, one of the other questions I get is, okay, maybe I'm convinced to run my SAP on Microsoft Azure, but what else is available on Microsoft Azure? And I think that's also interesting to consider, because Microsoft Azure is not necessarily only the infrastructure which is given as a service to you, but of course it also provides you some very nice modules around platform as a service. Think about the flexibility that you can have here to build in or integrate new applications, about the integration possibilities with your Active Directory, meaning the existing situation you have providing a smooth access to the customers you have today. Provide or look into other possibilities to develop new things which are in the pipeline. These are really the very interesting things we see often popping up again when we go for a nice combination running SAP on Microsoft Azure. In the second part, I'm going to provide you some insight in the journey that we have been into when running and deploying SAP environments on Azure for multiple customers over the last years. Typically, when you have decided to move on with the SAP environment, the first thing we are going to do, of course, is to look into how the functionality will be translated into very technical components. So what we will do here is look into what are the tiers that we need to set up. Think about the development tiers, think about the quality tiers and the production tiers. And then, of course, we will look into what we really need in terms of resources, in terms of infrastructure to build this architecture. We will, of course, look into what is the compute typically you need, what is the storage, how about the backup things that you need to bear in mind. So typically, these are all the things that you put together in this kind of a design. And then, of course, since you're moving to the cloud, one of the aspects could be asking the question here, which is the cloud region I prefer to go through? Will that be in Europe, or is it more convenient to go to the US, for instance? As an example, if you have a huge part of users sitting in the US, it might be interesting, worthwhile, having it deployed in the US cloud region. However, what we have noticed is that connectivity really is key when considering an architecture. Why is that? Well, obviously, if you move your infrastructure to the cloud, you completely depend on your connectivity. So you really have to look very close what you have in place in terms of connectivity. What is that you have in technology? What is it that this technology brings in terms of availability? How are my users organized? How will they get connected to the SAP network once it is all moved to the cloud? So connectivity really is a key part of the architecture when moving forward on the design. And that actually brings me to the fact that the architecture really should be, like we say, user-centric. It means that you have to put the user in the middle. Think about the different components that you need to build a complete design. Think about how the user is going to connect to the SAP environment, what the security measures will be, what the technology will be, because maybe you will have a lot of remote users, and then of course the question is, how can you get a secure connection to the SAP platform afterwards? Why is that so important? Well, let me give you an example. All of a sudden, we noticed that during the rollout of an S/4HANA implementation for one of our customers turned out to be slow for some remote users. That turned out because of the use of Fiori, which is actually the GUI as a standard when using S/4HANA. And actually, we learned that using Fiori is pretty delay sensitive. So it means that you need to understand what probably the cause could be of introducing delay in the whole picture, and by that you can eliminate these delays and see how you can still improve the end user experience of that remote user. And that is pretty convenient. Interesting to say here is that actually we found a solution by leveraging some existing features which were there in Azure. That's interesting to say. And then of course, looking at the end, what you want to reach here is to have a good user experience. And the user experience, what we have seen, is not only about the technology that you use, but is actually also a combination of the functional part and the technical part. Once you start tweaking into the functional part, obviously it will have an immediate impact on the technology as well. But in the end, and that is what we are aiming for, user experience is what you try to achieve. Imagine that you have decided to go for an S/4HANA platform. Then what you have been told is, of course, that the HANA database really comes with the speed of light. It will give you all the speed you need to get as fast as possible the numbers and the reports that you want to see. But of course, if you forget all the other components in the total picture, you will risk to turn out into rather a slow performance. And that is why I say user experience, building from a user-centric architecture really is key in the total design. Another interesting thing that we have seen is that you really need to have the experts on board. Why is that important? Well, you might consider like, okay, I'm going to the cloud. That should be like a click and play, right? Well, that's partially truth, but the interesting thing here is that we have seen during the deployment of one of our customers' environment that it is actually pretty interesting to see how the cloud data centers are built. Because when choosing resources to put together the right compute running the SAP environment, it turns out that there are some difference in choosing these resources and how these are talking to each other. So all of a sudden we have noticed that if you don't pick the right resources because you don't see how the underlying platform has been built, you might risk putting a wrong combination and end with a pretty slow performance. So have the experts on board and understand how the Azure platform has been built, have the correct communication to Microsoft Azure to talk about that, really is an added value here. And that, of course, brings me to the next topic, which is actually the fact that you are still working with two technology partners. You're working with Microsoft and SAP. So it is actually interesting to have a good understanding about the best practices when rolling out an SAP project on Azure. It's not sufficient understanding one or the other. Ideally, it's a good thing to have the best practices from an SAP perspective as well as from a Microsoft perspective. And secondly, I think it's also worth to have a partner in place who has the right escalation lines to the same technology partners mentioned here. Because actually that is what gives you the guarantee that in the end you will get what you expect to get when combining the best of both worlds. I told you in the beginning of my webinar that I would give you a concrete example how Agile turns to be in something realistic. Well, let me give you that example here. If you start running an SAP project on Azure, change really is a given all the time during the complete process. You will notify that you need the flexibility to adapt quickly to changes and to things maybe that you did not expect. So from that perspective, cloud really is a very interesting point. But agility also means that you should be able to adapt faster to changes that you did not see coming up upfront. For instance, companies all of a sudden decide to sell out a specific department or business unit, or they decide to do an acquisition. We have noticed here for a company that in a certain moment of time they asked us if they could add on some interesting features from a functional point of view within the SAP landscape. And we said, yeah, we are happy to do that, but we did not know what the impact would be on the development that we have been doing until that stage. And so we did not want to jeopardize the effort and all the days that we worked on that. So we took the opportunity to make a copy of the development environment onto Azure. We called it a Dev Plus environment. We start applying the changes that has been requested, and in the end we tested whether or not we wanted to move forward with the Dev or the Dev Plus environment. So here the advantage really was that the fact that the customer was not obliged to do any kind of investments or spending a lot of time from an operational perspective, but actually by mitigating risk here and leveraging the possibility, the agile aspect of the cloud, we could quickly anticipate to that changes and still afterwards make the right decision. That's a nice example of how agile turns into reality. Interesting is also to talk about certification. Why is certification important? Well, for another customer who was actually doing business in the aerospace, they told us that they were obliged to have 2 very specific certifications for doing business with the US Army. And that is also the reason why they decided to use 2 cloud data centers, being one in Europe and one in the US. And the cloud data center in the US was actually used to serve their customers in the US. But still then, they were lacking the certifications. Well, lucky for us, onto the compliance card of Microsoft Azure, it turned out that those 2 specific certifications were there per default. So imagine, really, it is a click in the box. It's actually something that you're very happy about, because I can tell you that it was a very specific certification, so you can imagine that it really helped the customer moving forward quickly and decide to go for the platform and this combination being SAP and Azure. So, we have now seen some examples on how we have experienced in reality the deployment of SAP on Azure. So let me summarize what we have seen as the real value, comparing the theory with what we have seen in the field. First thing, like I explained, Agile really is something that we have been facing in a very positive way. Like I explained to you before, anticipating to the business needs is something that you need those days and can happen during the SAP rollout. A second thing, obviously, is flexibility. Think about the different steps that you need to take to go there. You need flexibility to find out what is now the final configuration that I will need to get the best user experience. From a user-centric perspective, really, you need to have this flexibility in the end to be successful. And last but not least, of course, future-proof. You are in the cloud. It means that the cloud really is a fast-moving thing. It changes all the times. Things pop up on a daily basis, and it's up to you to decide whether you want to leverage them or not. But the interesting thing here is that you are on the right platform, just picking the things that you need to, for instance, initiate some interesting business initiatives. Okay, so now we come to some interesting conclusions about what I have been explaining to you. So first, cloud is not a click and play. It's absolutely key to have the experts and the expertise and to understand how the different components in cloud have been built. So at least it will give you the possibility to pick the right resources and understand why you are looking for this or that kind of combination of resources. A second thing is that really you should look into a user-centric architecture. Don't look or don't focus too much or one on another. Look into a combination of all the components from a technical and a functional perspective, understanding both technologies when you're looking at SAP running on Azure. As I said, Agile is a must. We talked about that before. That should be obvious. And then here is also a very interesting one. When you go and decide for doing a setup or a migration to Microsoft Azure, the governance model really is very important here. The governance model really helps you in identifying all the issues that you can expect when moving or migrating from your SAP environment to Microsoft Azure, and it is actually the best way in checking where you are and what needs to be done, how adaptations need to be done, just to make the project successful. And that is why the governance model really is important to mention here. And last but not least, of course, I think it is all clear that some expertise really is a must. If you do this for the first time, probably you will face some issues, but then still expertise can help you because of the fact that it's a combination of both technology, SAP and Microsoft. So obviously expertise is something very worthwhile. Thank you very much. This brings me to the end of my webinar. I hope it was very interesting for you, and there is now some room left to ask questions.